Hi, this is Adam Elio Berkowitz from Israel 365 News. I'm here with a very special guest. This is, I want to call you Rabbi Shaul Magid. Shaul is a college professor. I'd like Shaul to introduce himself. So, Shaul, tell us who you are and
Okay.
why.
All right.
Actually, before you do that, this is his book that I actually got and learned from. I was using it as a primer to help me learn New Testament, which was an interesting experience we'll talk about. So, Shaul, tell me about yourself.
Well, yeah, I am as you said. I'm a professor at Dartmouth College, and I also work as a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in New York, and I'm a senior fellow at the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard. And I work on a variety of things. I mean, this book that you mentioned is one of them. I work basically in modern Jewish thought from early modernity to the present, and I really uh, surreptitiously discovered this this very strange figure, Eliyahu Tzvi Soloveitchik, was obviously from the Soloveitchik dynasty, a very early generation of the Soloveitchik dynasty. He's actually the the grandson of Chaim of Volozhin. He's the daughter of Chaim of Volozhin's daughter. He's the son of Chaim of Volozhin's daughter.
To
And
just to put it into context for the viewers, we're talking about literally one of the, if not the most prestigious families, dynasties in Judaism. All of them scholars and leaders and very holy men.
right,
So we're talking about someone very serious and very important.
right. This is a very, very important rabbinic dynasty. In any event, he at some point in time he discovers Christianity, and he's living in Volozhin and Slutsk in Russia. I mean, in a totally fully absorbed Jewish world. But he discovers Christianity, and he comes up with a theory about Judaism and Christianity, arguing that there really isn't much of a difference between them, and that in fact he goes about to show by writing what is the first modern Hebrew commentary to the New Testament that if you look at the Gospels, particularly Mark and Matthew, those are the two that we have. There was a commentary to Luke also, but we don't see it, doesn't seem to have survived. If you look at Mark and Matthew through the lens of Chazal, of rabbinic literature, and Maimonides, he can show you that Christianity and Judaism are really basically the same thing. Now, what does he mean by Christianity is a good question. I think that one of the things that Soloveitchik doesn't do, but maybe we should do, for the purposes of this interview, is make the distinction between what was called, or what's called by scholars, the Jesus movement and Christianity. When does Christianity actually really begin? And the Jesus movement was a movement of individuals who were followers of Jesus, who believed that Jesus was the Messiah. Um, all of them were Jews. All of the authors of the books of Matthew and Mark, and likely Luke, and probably John too, were Jews. And that the Jesus movement was a kind of offshoot of Judaism at the time of the destruction of the Second Temple, around the middle of the first century of the Common Era, and in many ways a response to the destruction of the Second Temple. So whereas those that would become the rabbis, and a lot of people like to make the connection between the Pharisees and the rabbis, but there's really not much of a connection between them. Anyway, those that would become the rabbis begin to reconstruct Jewish life outside of its territorial centrality of the Jerusalem temple in the land of Israel. And the result of that is what we call today Judaism. I mean, obviously, a couple of centuries later, the Mishnah, and then the Talmud, and so on. And this Jesus movement group basically had another alternative. And the other alternative was basically that the Messiah had come. And that,
I love the way you're describing it, because you're talking about two branches, if I can use a prophetic image, and not two separate religions.
well,
Am
there
I
is
am I
no two
understanding?
separate religions. There is no two separate religions until fairly long after that. So there's a famous debate among scholars of Christianity called "The Ways That Parted." Knows when did Judaism and Christianity become two separate religions? And there's a whole debate about that. There's a book written called The Ways That Never Parted, which basically argues that the separation of Judaism and Christianity doesn't finalize itself into the early Middle Ages. That means that even up until the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries, there were books written by Christians who were Jews who felt that they still were writing about Judaism. Right? I could talk about what some of those books are. So anyway, Soloveitchik himself basically is coming to us in the 19th century. So by that time, there are surely two very different religions. And those two very different religions are really in a kind of constant battle between the right to be able to be the inheritors of Scripture. And so in a sense, you have cases where, for example, one quote that I always like to use is by Leo Strauss, who writes as follows. And Leo Strauss is writing in the early 20th century, a Jewish German philosopher who's writing in the early 20th century, says, "There is no reconciliation between Judaism and Christianity. Judaism is the anti-Christian principle, pure and simple." Right? So this is something that's actually quite normative by that time, of the lack of the ability for there to be a reconciliation. They are opposing religions, each making a claim to the covenant, and therefore there is no reconciliation between them. Now, let me read you one more line. And this line is from Justice Moshe Silberg of the Israeli Supreme Court in 1959. Some of you might know that in 1959, 1960, there was a famous Supreme Court case which became known as the case of Who is a Jew, that where the Supreme Court had to determine the Jewishness of a person named Oswald Rufusson, who went by the name of Brother Daniel. And Oswald Rufusson, it's a fascinating story, and I'm happy to talk about that as well, was a Jew from Poland who was able to disguise himself, because he spoke German fluently, as a Polish Gentile who spoke German fluently, who then worked for the Nazi police, translating in Russia. And he ended up saving tens of thousands of Jewish lives, because when the Germans decided that they were going to go and liquidate a town, this person, Rufusson, was able to go to the town beforehand and tell the Jews that the Germans were coming, and the Germans would come, the town the Jews had all left. Anyway, through a course of events, he ends up running away because he's found out. He ends up entering a convent, and he converts to Christianity. And he becomes a monk, becomes a Carmelite monk. And then after the war in the 1950s, he tries to immigrate to Israel under the law of return. And he comes to the immigration offices dressed fully in his Carmelite monastic clothing. And they say to him, "You're a monk, you're a Christian." He says, "No, I'm a Jew." And his Jewishness is never questioned. Anyway, they deny him entry into the country under the law of return because he's a Christian. He then takes it to the Supreme Court, and that becomes the Who is a Jew case. And the Supreme Court rules that because he had become, a Jew of no religion can still be considered a Jew, because the state of Israel was built by secular Jews. But a Jew who converts to another religion is no longer considered a Jew according to the laws of the state. The interesting thing about it is the Rabbanut ruled against the Supreme Court and said that he's a meshumad, in other words, he's a convert, he's an apostate, but he's still a Jew, basing themselves on the Talmudic premise, a Jew that sins is still a Jew. So it's a very interesting case. Now, what ends up happening to Rufusson, he ends up immigrating to Israel. He lives at the Stella Maris Monastery in Haifa, and he spends the rest of his life traveling around Israel teaching Israelis about Christianity. It's a fascinating story. There's a biography written about it.
And it's an issue that's still being debated in Israel, who's a Jew.
Right, exactly. There's a woman named Nechama Tech wrote a biography of him called In the Lion's Den. He died in 1990, 1991. Anyway, I bring that up just to say that that Brother Daniel and Elijah Svi Soloveitchik had a kind of a similar idea, that this whole notion of the irreconcilability of Judaism and Christianity really can't hold the weight of close readings of the tradition. Now, the difference between them, of course, is that Rufusson becomes a Christian. Soloveitchik doesn't become a Christian. The question is, why doesn't Soloveitchik become a Christian? And I argue in my book that the reason that Soloveitchik doesn't become a Christian is that he believes there's no reason to convert to Christianity because there's ultimately no difference between Judaism and Christianity.
Really?
Not because Christianity is a false religion, but because they're basically the same. So if Judaism and Christianity are basically the same, why I'm born a Jew, why should I become a Christian?
I've heard people say, Judaism and Christianity, the same thing, except for Jesus.
But that's the whole thing. The interesting thing I would respond to is I say the thing that actually ties Judaism to Christianity is Jesus. Now, not what later Christians did with Jesus, but with Jesus as a historical figure. Right? So in a certain sense, the very notion of the incarnation, the very concept of the Trinity, all of these different things that come about through the Council of Nicaea in the 3rd and the 4th and the 5th centuries, really, they make Jesus into a Christ figure, right? So there's this kind of distinction within Christianity between Jesus as a historical figure and Jesus as a Christ figure, right?
So if I understand you correctly, which is an interesting experience because I understood the book to a certain degree, you're saying that Rav Soloveitchik wrote this book, a commentary on the New Testament, in order to demonstrate that there are not only not irreconcilable differences, but their literature is acceptable and to a Jew. Is that accurate?
What Soloveitchik is saying is there is nothing that Jesus said that is recorded in the Gospels. Now, Mark and Matthew, the earlier Gospels, right? There's nothing that Jesus said in those. Now, whether Jesus said it or not, we don't know. That's a separate question. But there's nothing that Jesus said in those texts that contradicts Judaism.
Amazing.
That's basically his point. If you can understand it the way Soloveitchik understands his interpretation of it through Chazal and Maimonides, in particular, there's nothing that he says that actually contradicts Judaism. Now, it is true, and everybody knows this who reads the New Testament, that Jesus never says he's the Son of God, right? That, Jesus is, in fact, when he's asked by the Pharisees at Capernaum, are you the Son of God? He just responds by saying, I am what you say I am. Like, I'm not, it's the classic deflection, right? You said it. I didn't say it. Right?
I hear it when I read that as a Jew, I was like, he's the Son of God. Well, so am I. So are we all. It's not a stretch.
Right. The Son of God, the Son of Man, from the use of the term the Son of Man in the prophets and so on. So he's making now. Here's the interesting thing. Here a guy comes in the 19th century. Judaism and Christianity are obviously not only separate religions. They stand in opposition to each other. And this is the interesting thing. There was a movement in the mid-19th century with Tsar Alexander II to convert the Jews to Christianity in Russia. And there was an entire foundation set up by someone named Alexander McCall in England, which was the Society for the Conversion of the Jews, that were brought into Russia to try to convert the Jews to Christianity. Why did he want to convert the Jews to Christianity? Because he understood that converting the Jews to Christianity was really converting them to the religion of the Enlightenment. To bringing them up to speed in terms of the modern world. Soloveitchik is living at that time, precisely at that time. Now, that Society for the Conversion of Jews to Christianity wasn't that successful. There were Jews who converted to Christianity. And what do we find in that time? We find, for example, Yiddish translations of the New Testament that were produced in order to be used as missionizing tools to convert the Jews to Christianity. There are some very interesting Meshumadim who worked for McCall, who translated a lot of his English work into Hebrew. And I think Soloveitchik is aware of that. Because he's aware that there's a movement afoot in Russia to convert the Jews to Christianity. And as opposed to taking the more traditional tack was that, oh, no, Christianity is a false religion. You can't convert to Judaism is the true religion. Christianity is a false religion. They're irreconcilable. Don't convert. Soloveitchik is saying don't convert, but not because they're irreconcilable, because they're basically the same thing.
That's a huge statement that I need a moment to take.
Right. Now,
and it's huge historically because after the initial Christians, the only relationship between Jews and Christians was confrontational, I think. And the only reason why a Jew would read the New Testament was in order to engage in that confrontation.
And as a polemic, right.
As a polemic.
Right. But there are works that we have, like the Pseudo-Clementine homilies from the 4th century, that is a Jewish Christian text. This is a text written by Jews who are Christians. So it hasn't been completely, the separation had not taken place by the 4th or even 5th centuries. There's still kind of an interaction among people who are both believers in Jesus and also Jews. When that finally ends, we don't know for sure. Now, I will say another thing. The big break traditionally, and I think that scholars have shown this not to be the case, is the conversion of the Roman Empire to Christianity with Emperor Constantine in the 4th century. Once, and that is when Christianity becomes a religion for the Gentiles. And this was a big machloket in the early period between Paul and James. James basically thought that the Jesus movement should remain solely among the Jews, and that they shouldn't evangelize to the Gentiles. And Jesus is recorded as saying in the Gospels, oh, no, my message is not for the Gentiles. My message is only for the Jews, right? Jesus is a Jew that's born in Eretz Yisrael, lives in Eretz Yisrael, and dies in Eretz Yisrael. Right? Whereas Paul made the argument that, no, we have the truth. We therefore have to spread the truth to the rest of the world. So evangelism to the Gentiles, in a certain sense, is seen traditionally as being the real break between Judaism and Christianity, although later scholars have said that it's not so simple, that that's what Paul wanted to do, and so on. So I think that the Paul-James machloket is a really important moment in early Christianity, whether Christianity should be spread to the Gentiles or not, which is like Or L'Goyim. That was Paul's understanding of Or L'Goyim, that the Jews should
just
be,
for the non-Hebrew speakers, that means a light unto the nations.
Light unto the nations. So what is the relationship between Jews and Judaism to the rest of the world? That's an open question. And Paul had a particular view of what that meant, and the rabbis had another view of what that meant. They created the Noahide laws, right? That was something that was created a little bit later to say, yeah, you can be a righteous Gentile, but you don't have to be a Jew. And Paul was basically making a different claim and saying, no, I want to spread Judaism to the world. In a certain sense, that's what Christianity is for Paul. It's the spreading of Judaism to the world.
It's funny you say that. And I'm going to do something I normally don't do in interviews, which is interject a personal experience, which is I connect an awful lot with Christians. And I've even been accused personally of being a Christian missionary, which my wife thinks is hilarious. I'm not sophisticated or savvy enough to hold that many thoughts in my head. But I find that there was this monolithic building walls kind of attitude that was brought about in Judaism, where the idea of being a light unto the nations meant being totally separate and not connecting. And any Jew who had a meaningful spiritual contact with Christians was considered, they're like, oh, they're a Christian missionary. One of you has to be trying to convert the other. And my personal experience has been that the contact that I've had with Christians can frequently be an incredibly enlightening one for both in both directions. And I see that as being a light unto the nations. And when I say, oh, this is us being a light unto the nations, and they're looking for us to spread that light, and I'm told, oh, no, 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 that's missionizing.
Right.
Um, so to say that at one point that was the division within Christianity, it's funny because I think we're coming full circle,
So this,
where Israel is becoming a light unto the nations once again, and there's a lot of resistance among Orthodox Jews to taking that back and taking that role back as being a light unto the nations.
yeah. So there's a couple of things I want to say to that. It's good. It's a good anecdote. I think that Jews and Christians have two um, separate. They have two separate things that have to do in order to break down some of those barriers, if that's what they want to do. For Christianity is built on this principle called supersessionism. That is, that Christians are the new Israel, and that Christianity supersedes Judaism, and that Judaism essentially has no reason to exist once Christianity comes into the world. That the notion of the supersessionist doctrine doesn't leave room for Judaism's existence because Christianity views itself as the fulfillment of Judaism.
The new covenant.
And yes, right, this new covenant, the Brit HaChadashah, the new covenant. And I think Christians have really struggled with what it would mean to abandon the principle of supersessionism and to say that Christianity doesn't come to replace Judaism, Christianity comes to live beside Judaism. Right? Now, there are all these different theories, dual covenant theologies, and all kinds of things that kind of happen. Jews, on the other hand, have to really seriously consider whether they want to abandon this notion that Christianity is idolatry. And therefore, there's a zero-sum game, right, in terms of how Jews can relate to Christianity, whether Jews can go into a church, whether Jews can read the New Testament. And I think that the idea of Christianity being idolatry, and not all Jews think that way, but that's become the normative position for the most part.
I hear it. I hear it an awful lot from
Yeah,
the Jews who criticize what I'm doing.
of course. I mean, that's the basic standard claim that Christianity is avodah zarah. Now, and there were people like Menachem HaMeiri in the 14th century that came off and said, no, that's not true anymore, and Christianity is just another form of monotheism. But if it's another form of monotheism, then it really puts it in much closer proximity to Judaism. And then you ask the question, well, if it's another form of monotheism, so then if I can I pray with Christians? Can I practice with Christians? Can I attend church? Can I learn the New Testament? It opens up a whole different thing about Christianity. Now, a lot of that for Jews comes from a lot of blood and a lot of persecution and a lot of hatred of Christendom towards Jews over the course of the last millennia. And for Christians, it really does. For Christians, the idea of supersessionism is so deeply embedded in Christianity that it's unclear whether they can disembed that particular idea. I sometimes say when I give talks on this matter, that what supersessionism to Christians is what being a chosen people is to Jews. To eradicate that, to excise that from Judaism, the idea of being a chosen people, to excise supersession from Christianity is like a serious operation. And I think that Jews have been struggling with it in order to be able to talk to Christians. Christians have been struggling with able to talk to Jews. So let me make a very quick recommendation. There's a great new book by an Israeli scholar named Karma Ben Yochanan called Jacob's Younger Brother, and it's on Christian-Jewish relations after Vatican II. That's what the book is called, Jacob's Younger Brother. It's a fascinating analysis of the ways in which Christians, and she's particularly interested in Catholicism and Orthodox Judaism, because a lot of the interfaith dialogue that's taken place over the past century has been between Protestants and liberal Jews.
Yes.
not between Catholics and Orthodox Jews. So she's focusing only on Catholics and Orthodox Jews, which is fascinating in a lot of ways. And she shows the way in which post-Vatican II, after the Second Vatican Council in the early 1960s, when the Catholic Church did go quite far in its reassessment of its relationship to Judaism, and how did Orthodox Jews respond to Vatican II? Now,
it's interesting you mentioned that, because when I first started doing, I was never when I started becoming religiously observant and taking my religious life seriously, I was never attracted or tempted in any way to go into interfaith. I just saw it as empty. It was like this kumbaya, we're all the same, and we're not all the same.
right.
And if anything, I find that this new connection and being a light unto the nations, the goal is for me to be a better Jew and to serve God better through this connection, and for the Christian to be a better Christian. And that's not interfaith.
Right. I think it's a different iteration of interfaith, in the sense of the recognition of differences and the tolerance of differences rather than the commonalities. It's funny, like, what would someone like Elijah Tzvi Soloveitchik think of interfaith dialogue? There was no interfaith dialogue
Right.
when he was alive in the
Right.
mid-19th century. What would he think of it? I'm not sure he would be that impressed with it, frankly, because, look, Soloveitchik is a
I'm
Lithuanian
sorry if
Jew
you can
from
hear me.
Volozhin, right? I mean, he's
You
basically a base
picked out for
Medrash
a
Jew.
moment.
For example, there's a lot of Jews that are writing about Christianity at that time, people like Abraham Geiger from the Reform movement, who had a lot to say about Jesus and the whole historical Jesus movement that was happening. I mean, there was a movement that was started in the mid-19th century among Protestants called the Search for the Historical Jesus, which was trying to historicize Jesus away from being the Christ figure back into being a historical figure. And many Jews kind of got on that bandwagon because they said, oh, that's good for us. Because if Jesus is just a historical figure, we can use him. And famously, Geiger, I don't know if Geiger said it or somebody said it about Geiger, that Judaism is the religion of Jesus and Christianity is the religion about Jesus. As trying, because in the 19th century, what these theologians were trying to do is to say, oh, the true ethical monotheism, the true moral religion you're saying is Christianity. We're saying, no, it's not the religion of Jesus. It's not the religion about Jesus. It's the religion of Jesus, which is Judaism. So there was a competition, right?
It's funny because a lot of Christians are now searching for the religion of Jesus.
Right. There's all these new Hebrew movements, and a lot of stuff is going on within the Protestant churches, not within the Catholic Church, but within the Protestant churches, a lot of stuff is going on of wanting to live the life of Jesus. It's a kind of like Christian Wahhabism, right? The Wahhabis are really all about living the life of Muhammad and trying to replicate the life of Muhammad. And there's a lot of movements within Judaism, within Christianity, that are trying to do the same. But here's the rub. And this goes, by the way, also to Christian Zionism, which is a really important piece of this, because those Christians in America, the Protestants in America, that are most sympathetic to Judaism are Christian Zionists. The question, people like John Hagee and others, the question is, what do they really want? And what is this notion of being open to Judaism? Right.
That's the question that all the Orthodox Jews ask, and they think there's some insidious hidden agenda.
Well, I don't think it's insidious. I don't think it's a hidden agenda. I think it's right out front. I think it's about dispensationalism. It's about the idea that the dispensation or the second coming of Christ comes about when all the Jews return to Israel. I mean, it's not. There's nothing. I mean, you could see it in Scripture. You could see it in the Book of Revelation, right? There's nothing secret about it. Right? So that, in a sense, that group of people who are giving millions and millions of dollars to Israel are doing so because the Jews returning to Israel fits into their dispensationalist theology. And the Israelis that take that money, they know exactly what it is. It's very funny. I'll give you an example. John Hagee, who is one of the leading Christian Zionist was invited to give the invocation at the tekes, at the ceremony for the Jerusalem embassy. You can see it on
Yeah.
YouTube. So he's sitting there. I mean, he gets up there. The front row is all these kind of Haredi Jews from the Rabbanut that are sitting there as part of the, they're part of the government, and all these other government officials. And what does Hagee do? He gets up and he starts talking about Jesus in front of all of these Haredim,
Yeah.
right? Now, he knew exactly what he was doing, right? But he was being honest. He was saying, look, from our perspective, your presence here is important because you set the conditions for the second coming of Christ. Now, if you look at what happens in the book of Revelation when Christ returns, it's not a very pretty picture for the Jews. The Jews will have the opportunity to repent and believe in Jesus. And if they refuse to do so, the earth will open up and swallow them. That's what the book of Revelation says.
Yeah, I know, and it's kind of funny when I relate to my Christians. I've never had them come out and say, we reject this, so I know it's still there. But my attitude is like, when the time comes, we'll talk.
Yeah. No, so that's the basic attitude that I think the Israeli government takes too. It's like, I'll be cynical about your theology, you can be cynical about my theology. Right now, I need your money, and right now, I need the Jews to be in the land of Israel. So exactly, when the time comes, we'll talk. It is. I mean, there is something to that. I appreciate that. It's a bit of a dual cynicism more than a dual covenantal theology.
Yeah.
Right. I don't take you seriously. You don't take me seriously. But right now, today in 2023, we actually have something we can talk about.
Mm. Okay, so this was the initial motivation for me reaching out to you and wanting to talk to you. I read your book. It's amazing. For an Orthodox Jew, I mean, I spent way too many years in a yeshiva learning Talmud, learning what Jews learn in yeshiva, and and we were pretty pardon me, pretty structured in what we learned. And if you had told me back then that I would be learning the New Testament, I would have thought you were crazy. Um, and I was learning, when I learned the New Testament, I learned with some very dear Christian friends who were very supportive of Israel. And I think it was an interesting experience because they weren't trying to convert me at all. There was none of that. And I kind of consider myself, and I hope I'm correct, I consider myself unconvertible. I'm a hard top, I if I come down one day in the living room in the morning and say to my wife, "Oh, I've discovered Jesus," she'll be like, "Have another cup of coffee."
Right.
It's not going to happen. I'm a Jew living in the land of Israel. I'm very set in my ways. I know a lot of Christians, and I'm learning the New Testament, and I'm finding it to be not only intellectually interesting, but it feels like a very Jewish book to me. It feels like it feels like Jesus is like, he's like Hillel, Shammai, Jesus. He's just another school of thought to enter into the dialogue.
I think that's certainly true reading Mark, Matthew, and Luke, maybe reading Acts. Reading John is a bit different because John really does come out pretty strongly against the Jews, even though the authors of John might have been Jews. But scholars say that John was probably responding to Jesus movement members being kicked out of the synagogues, because that's kind of what happens, right? There's a kind of pushback and resentment for that. But I think a few things. I think certainly the Synoptic Gospels, and I would even say Paul's letters, they're Jewish texts. There's no doubt there's Jewish texts. They're written in Greek. They're not written in Hebrew. They're not written in Hebrew. We once thought that maybe there was an original Hebrew version. There's no original Hebrew version. They were written in Greek, but there are many Jewish texts written in Greek at that time. One of the things that it does do for us is that I think from a historical perspective, I think we have to recognize We have very, very little literature from Jews about Jews in the first century of the Common Era. Very little really survived. Much of what we know about the Second Temple, we know from centuries later. There are texts, obviously the books of the Maccabees and so on and so forth. We do have Jewish texts and many apocryphal texts and books of Enoch that probably was around that. But we don't really have a lot. So the New Testament gives us authentic Jewish texts from a century where we have very, very little historical data. That's number one. I think now I can understand a frum Jew saying, like, who cares, right? I only care what the Masorah says. I only care what the tradition says. I care what the Gemara says. I don't care what the temple was really like. I care what the Talmud tells me the temple was really like. That's a legitimate claim. I mean, one doesn't have to have a historical perspective to be an Orthodox Jew or a frum Jew. In fact, the historical perspective kind of gets in the way, right? Because it's going to challenge those accepted norms. So I think that's one thing. I think the second thing is that the New Testament teaches us a credible amount about Western civilization, because Western civilization is Christianity, right? And the third thing is that I think it teaches us a lot about Judaism, a lot about nascent Judaism. Like, as Judaism was really taking form, this gives us a window into that we don't have otherwise.
That was the thing that I got out of it. That was like pure gold for me.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example, a real eye opener. First of all, there's so many things. The whole context is more Jewish than anything you can find outside of Israel. I mean, he's jumping into a they call it baptism. I call it mikveh. When I was living in Gush
they called it mikveh.
They called it mikveh. Exactly. I was when I was in yeshiva, we were jumping into ice cold natural springs at 5 in the morning, and yes, the heavens opened up. It was like, it was a real thing. But so all the context was very Jewish. What blew me away was I realized. I think forgive me if I get it wrong. I have to do chazar. I have to go over the material again.
Yeah.
But when they were walking in the field and they were plucking the wheat,
corn, yeah.
And some people may read that and say, "Oh, he's rejecting the Sabbath. He's rejecting the Sabbath laws." And I looked at it, I realized, and I from your book, I understood that what he was doing is Jesus was a different school of thought regarding the laws of Shabbat. He wasn't rejecting them. He's saying, this is my school of thought. You say we don't do this. I say we do this. I have a Masorah. I have a tradition. I'm a school of thought. And for me, that's a valid methodology. That's a valid stance to take in halacha. And
not only, let me just interrupt you for 1 second. I think to add to what you're saying, I think we have to really recognize that in the first century of the Common Era, what we call halacha didn't really exist. Exactly. There were certain norms. It was a liquid system.
It hadn't been established. Right. It was still a dynamic.
And it was very regional. For example, like the Jews in Galilee didn't wash their hands before there were different customs. That, so when Jesus refuses to wash his hands in Jerusalem, that there were, he's coming from the Galilee with that, to use our language, right? That wasn't their minhag. So we're talking about a very liquid system. So when Jesus plucks corn on Shabbat, when Jesus faith heals on Shabbat, those kinds of things, he was doing it provocatively. He was definitely a provocateur, right? There's no doubt about that. But the idea that he was rejecting something already assumes that there's something to be rejected. And I think that's part of the problem.
I remember there's a Mishnah in Masechet Eduyot, which is, it's the no, it's not the last one. I think it's in the final chapter though, where there was a dispute between Hillel and Shammai having to do with Yibum, having to do with Levirate marriage. And it would have, according to Hillel, it would have rendered he would have said this woman is not a single woman. You can't marry her. The children will be mamzerim, will be illegitimate. And according to Shammai, she was legitimate to be married. The children would have been legitimate. And the Mishnah ends and says, and yet the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai, they married each other. They were meaning, as long as you have a teaching that you hold by, and this is your methodology, I'll accept that in you. I'll accept your ruling. It's as long as you're holding by your methodology. And when I took that and I applied it to what I was seeing in the New Testament, it's like Jesus had his methodology this was his Torah. This was his Jewish law. And he was flying with it. He was going along that.
Look, again, if you're willing to, and this is a struggle within Orthodox Judaism in general. I mean, I was an Orthodox Jew for 30 years, so I think I know from the inside that if you accept the Orthodox normative principles, that the notion of a system of halacha, even though it wasn't codified like the Shulchan Aruch or like the Mishnah Torah or like the Tur Shulchan Aruch, but that there was already a stable system of Jewish practice, you can say, okay, Jesus was contesting that. If you say that there really wasn't a stable system of Jewish practice, so that we're being somewhat anachronistic to call it halacha, Jesus breaks halacha, right? Then we get a very different picture. So I'll give you an example. Kaufman Kohler, who was the rector of Hebrew Union College, he was one of the leading Reform rabbis of his generation. He was one of the editors of the Jewish Encyclopedia, and he was really a fantastic scholar of early Christianity. And he writes a book called The Church and the Synagogue. And in The Church and the Synagogue, he basically says, if we want to talk about it in our language, Jesus was kind of like the first Reformed Jew. He was challenging a system. And as you said, he was interpreting the law to mean something that the Pharisees had problems with. Now, I know as an Orthodox Jew, you're kind of like, making a face that Jesus was a Reformed Jew, right? But I understand that. But
no, I actually think he was a lot closer to Orthodox Judaism than the Reformed Jews are today.
Right. Well, that may be, but in other words, what Kohler was saying was that Jesus was one among probably many, many others that we don't know because nothing of them survived, that were challenging the authority of the rabbis, whoever they were, wherever they were, to be able to determine Jewish practice. And that challenge attracted groups of people, right? Because remember, he had a following before he died, right? So there were already people that were following him who were sympathetic to his challenge to the rabbinic elite. Again, we're only learning this from the gospel. We don't really know what happened actually, right? We have no documentation in real time what was going on, but that's certainly the way the gospel presents it.
That's fascinating. My rabbi once taught me, I think in the name of the Maharal, that it's, and one of the objections to the Rambam was that he codified the Jewish law, and the rabbis were afraid that it would lead to the people stopping learning. They wouldn't learn anymore because everything was, you just look in the Rambam but as opposed to having to struggle with the entire, with all of the texts and to work them through and figure out, what you thought the halacha was, right. The Rambam codified it. So that seemed to be like at the time of Jesus, as you're describing it, that everyone was involved in that process. When it came time to decide if something was kosher or not, you had to decide for yourself. There wasn't any Shulchan Aruch, any codified law.
Right. And more than that, there really wasn't even much of a textual tradition that was accepted by everybody. So there's, we have to realize when you talk about the first century, you're not talking about a culture of literacy. You're talking about a culture of orality for the most part. That's just not to say that there weren't texts. There were certainly texts, but most Jews couldn't read them.
Okay, so if I can, the whole purpose of this interview or the title we're putting it under. If an Orthodox Jew walks up to you and says, why, and asks, why should I learn the New Testament? Al Regel Echad.
Right. I
How
would
would you
say
answer it?
I would say three things. I would say if you're interested in what life among Jews was like in the first century of the Common Era, that's one of the only portals that we have. That was things that were written at that time, first and second century. That's number one. Second of all, if I think learning the New Testament will teach you something about Jesus as a Jew that seeing him through the lens of Christianity will not teach you. So go back to the source. Go back to the source. Read the text. Obviously, it's going to be in a translation, unless you read Greek, right? It's going to be in a translation, and you will get a window into what Judaism was like in the first century that you have no access to otherwise, unless you're going to believe that the rabbis 5 centuries later are telling the historical truth. Now,
Wow.
the rabbis in Bavel, thousands of miles away from Eretz Yisrael, half a millennium away in years, are basically describing what life was like at Bayit Sheni. That's what we're reliant on. That's what the Masoret is reliant on. And this is a way of saying there's an opportunity to be able to do it otherwise. And that would be one thing I would say. And second of all, I think you read the New Testament and you really kind of understand what Christianity is. You want to know about what Christianity is, what Jews who are polemicizing against Christianity said it was. Okay, you could do that, and then you can also learn about what Christianity is.
To be really honest, I think I'm getting more of your first answer. Like I said, I'm watching Jesus jumping into the mikveh like I did. Someone pointed out to me, is fascinating. They make a big thing about him curing lepers.
Right.
But what was he doing? He was saying, okay, now you don't have leprosy. Go to the Kohen. Go to the temple. Why does he have to cure these people of leprosy? They weren't dying. He was curing them not of leprosy. He was curing them of tzaraat.
Yeah.
And he was saying, okay, now you're pure to go to the temple and do the service.
Right. Look, I mean, Israelite society, Jewish society in Eretz Yisrael in the first century was falling apart. The temple was basically simply an arm of the empire at that point. It had no real autonomy. It certainly had no sovereignty. Right. The Sadducees were basically appointed by the prefect, who was an emissary of the emperor. Right. So in a sense, Jewish society in the first century was collapsing. Even before the rebellion in 60 and 66 and before the destruction in 70, it was really a shadow of itself. And it was preparing for some catastrophic destruction of Jerusalem, which actually happened. And so in a certain sense, the Jesus followers were a part of that world. And they were responding to the collapsing of the Jewish society that they were living in. And this was their response. And they
came along and they said, look, here's this young dynamic rabbi who can hold Judaism together. Let's listen to him.
Exactly. And more than that, he's coming as more than just a young dynamic rabbi. He's really coming as a messianic figure. He's coming as a messianic figure, but they were expecting a messianic figure. That was the whole point, right? The world was coming to an end.
Right. Bar Kochba and all. Yeah. So I get okay. This is my last question.
Okay.
You're filling in so many gaps in that I felt I had, and you're filling in the gaps. So I have to ask you this one more question. My impression is that Jesus was a very similar figure to the Baal Shem Tov in Hasidic Judaism, who was also incredibly divisive and polarizing.
Right.
Am I very far wrong on that?
Actually, Martin Buber wrote about that extensively. Martin Buber wrote an essay on Jesus, Shabtai Tzvi, and the Baal Shem Tov.
I I'm not enough of an academic. I
Yeah,
apologize.
what I'm saying is Buber really got that. Buber said, if you really want to understand the Baal Shem Tov, you have to understand Jesus, and if you really want to understand Jesus, you have to understand the Baal Shem Tov. Right?
So Hasidic Jews should go out and buy a New Testament?
They could do that. There are even Yiddish translations. This same Kaufman Kohler, who called Jesus, the first Reform rabbi, also claimed that the Jesus movement was a movement of early Hasidim.
I get that feeling in so many ways. It was about the Ruach. It was about, yeah, absolutely. Wow.
Actually,
Yeah.
the essay, Buber's essay is also includes Spinoza as one of the other characters.
Ah,
Right.
okay. I'm
So,
gonna have to do some reading.
in other words, these are Jewish figures who are rebelling against the normative system of their time, and in doing so, actually, on the one hand, break away. So Spinoza, Shabtai Tzvi, Jesus, and the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov is the only one who doesn't quite break away fully. And that's an interesting, if people that study early Hasidism before, let's say, 1815, like the early generations, it was not so clear that early on where Hasidism was going to end up, right? I mean, there was the famous edict of excommunication that the Vilna Gaon, supposedly agreed to, that they were considered a heretical sect that eventually made the decision not to actually step outside, but to remain inside. Wow. Had the Jesus movement done that, I want to end with one thing. So it take us back to the Israel thing. In Russia, in the early 19th century, there was a really interesting machloket between Yosef Chaim Brenner, the famous Israeli Hebraist, and Achad Ha'am. And it was about Jesus. And what they were arguing about was, as they were kind of constructing the new Zionist historiography, the new Zionist narrative, they wanted to recreate a new canon of Jewish heroes. Now, of course, we have Rabbi Akiva, but one of the things that gets introduced into that canon with Zionism is Bar Kokhba, who was a villain in Chazal and suddenly becomes a hero in Zionism. And then the question was whether to include Jesus. And Brenner wanted to, and Achad Ha'am didn't, right? And for Brenner, it's like Jesus is a perfect figure of Zionism. He was born, lived his life, and died in Eretz Yisrael. He never thought of leaving. His whole life was really about Eretz Yisrael. So obviously, Achad Ha'am had another view of it, but it's kind of interesting that Zionism in some way brings Jesus back. Because he's an Eretz Yisrael Jew, right? He's an Eretz Yisrael Jew from their perspective, right?
Boom.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna do something unusual. I'm going to give a disclaimer at the end of the video.
Okay.
My disclaimer is, first of all, I highly recommend your book, The Bible, the Talmud, and the New Testament. I highly recommend it to Jews and Christians. I am actually recommend. I'm personally going to look for another study partner to learn the New Testament. I am not in any way hinting that Jews should accept Jesus or become Christians or anything like that. I think it is a very good experience for Orthodox Jews, for religious Jews to look into this and to see, as you said, it's a window into the first century Judaism. I also recommend the book to Christians to give a more, how does a Jew understand the New Testament? How does a Jew understand Jewish Jesus? It's an amazing experience. And if any Jew feels like I'm trying to missionize him and convert him to Christianity, well, I think you should go to your rabbi and figure out why you think that everyone's trying to make you Christian. It's not true. And Christians, I absolutely did not mean any disrespect, or I did not mean to say Christianity is wrong or anything false. God forbid. I'm getting an awful lot from my connection with Christians, and the more real it becomes, the better it is for me as a Jew.
Right.
So,
I mean, I think what you're suggesting is it would be productive for Jews and Christians to step out of the
absolutely.
binary of true and false and good and bad, um,
Oh,
and just see the way in which Judaism and Christianity are really intertwined, whether we like it or not. And as much as Jews have been trying to separate themselves from Christianity, and as much as Christians have been trying to separate themselves from Judaism, they never really succeeded on some.
amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, Rob Shaul, thank you
Thanks a
very,
lot.
very much.
Thank you very much.
Please send me any links so that I can post the links for all our viewers. I think that this dialogue was so enormous. I'm going to recommend it to all my friends who really are trying to make this connection. Shaul, thank you so much. Be blessed. I can't wait till we meet in person and have several cups of coffee to discuss this.
I mean,
It's really it's amazing.
in Eretz Israel in June. We should make a time to meet.
I would be
Yeah, yeah.
totally blown
Let's
away,
do
and
that.
I know a lot of people who would benefit and really understand what you're saying. I
Okay,
appreciate it.
we'll try to set something up. That'd be great.
Okay, thank you so much. Don't go away.